All right, Pope Francis' coffin was taken back into St. Peter's Basilica at the end of his funeral mass at the Vatican. Pallbearers carried the simple wooden casket back into the Basilica almost 2 hours after it was brought out for the service, attended by world leaders. In a break from centuries of tradition, Pope Francis has, as per his final testament, will be the first pope in over a century to be buried outside the Vatican. His final resting place is Rome's Basilica of St. Mary Major, over 5 kilometers away from St. Peter's. The Argentine Pope passed away on Monday, 21st of April, at the age of 88 following a stroke. His death ushered in a period of ancient ritual and deep mourning for the 1.4 billion strong Roman Catholic Church. Over the past 3 days, around 250,000 people filed past his body, laid out in an open coffin before the altar of the 16th century St. Peter's Basilica. The open-air ceremony, witnessed by 220 cardinals, 750 bishops and more than 4,000 priests, was scheduled to last 90 minutes. Thousands of mourners reached the Vatican, with many camping out to watch the proceedings.
My wife and I thought it was important to come here. We had great respect for Pope Francis, and we thought such an event doesn't happen often in a lifetime, so we thought it was important to come here.
It's important for me to be here. We go to a Jesuit university, so first Jesuit Pope means a lot. He was such a wonderful man, and so it means a lot to be here in Rome, to be with everyone else, but also to celebrate the life of a wonderful man.
World leaders joined the legions of faithful to pay their final respects. The dignitaries included Indian President Murmu, who paid homage to the Pope on Friday. US President Donald Trump arrived with First Lady Melania Trump.
Marginalized. So people who've met him before as well. We've been told around 40 of them will be there. There might be more or less.
The dignitaries included the Indian President Murmu, who was attending the funeral mass as well. US President Donald Trump arrived with First Lady Melania Trump. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelenskyy came with his wife Olena Zelenska. French President Emmanuel Macron was also in attendance.
We see, yes.
This is the beginning of the
These are the live visuals that we're getting at the moment. These are live visuals coming from Rome. As you can see, thousands, millions have lined the streets here.
Indeed, and he's just, as you mentioned, crossed over the river. We saw that beautiful drone photography and that live video that we'll have more of here. And
yes, it's remarkable also. It's the first papal funeral, can we say, with this advanced technology.
All right. Also on the broadcast now, we're being joined by James Jackson from Berlin. He is a trained theologian, religious affairs expert and journalist. Thank you so much for joining us on WION The World is One right now.
Thanks for having me, as ever.
Of course, we would like to first discuss the life and legacy of the Pope. He always wanted to be remembered as the people's Pope. What do you have to say about this?
I think the People's Pope is very much a fair assessment of Pope Francis. Born Jorge Bergoglio in Argentina and later becoming the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he was from a very simple background and in fact even once worked as a nightclub bouncer. So this is a pope who was close to the people and who admitted some human flaws. He even admitted that he had doubts in entering the priesthood because of his feelings towards a woman. So this is a pope who spoke about his humanity as well as the humanity of others, which includes members of the LGBTQ community, which the Catholic Church has historically not had a very good a very good relationship with. Pope Francis set out to change that, as well as changing non-believers. So his relationship to non-believers. So in many cases, he simplified elements of the Catholic Church, of the ecclesiastical politics, and even the vestry, the robes. But that sometimes his critics would say that in itself was a symbol, because sometimes it even cost more money. So he had it was a very popular figure worldwide, connecting the Catholic Church to many non-believers, but arguably alienating some of the more strong Catholics and people who were higher up in the Vatican hierarchies. He had a lot of conflict with those. There have been corruption scandals, and Pope Francis reportedly always saw himself as something of an outsider in Rome. He was a Catholic. He was a Roman Catholic. He was the Bishop of Rome, which is the ecclesiastical name of the Pope, for the last 12 or so years of his life. But this is a Pope from the world to the world, as the Church is supposed to be, according to the Gospel. So this, Rome is the historic center of the Catholic faith, but as the Pope, you are the father to all Catholics. I believe that's where Pope Francis saw himself, not just to Catholics, but to all believers and even to non-believers, because this is a Pope who, for the first time in many decades, really involved himself in world politics, geopolitics, sometimes to people's delight and sometimes to their chagrin. So in some cases, for example, we saw that Zelenskyy, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, was here and was reportedly cheered when people saw him. But I think the relationship between the late Pope Francis and President Zelenskyy was a bit frostier than you might expect, because Pope Francis was very, very clear in pushing for a peace settlement in Ukraine, saying, we want to put an end to the war, which is the same thing which many of Zelenskyy's opponents would say. Zelenskyy, of course, wants to win that war with Russia, not to make a peace settlement where Russia can keep land. The same is true of Israel and Gaza. So many strong supporters of Israel may not like that the Pope almost every day called up the Christian church in Gaza. Of course, we're talking about Palestine, which is the historic home of Jesus Christ. It's known as the Holy Land. And that means that even though the number of Palestinian Christians now is quite small, they have very historic roots in the region. The Eastern Catholic tradition is slightly different from the Western one, but still recognizes the Pope. And I think it was particularly important for the Pope to minister to the priests left in Gaza during this war, and he has called many times for a peace settlement. So as you can see out on the street there, 250,000 people have gathered to mourn this person who they consider to be the People's Pope, and one of the most historic popes in recent decades, alongside John Paul.
Right, absolutely. Now, of course, you are a religious affairs expert as well. And I just wanted to discuss with you, how do you think the Pope was able to perhaps walk a tightrope when it comes to diplomatic as well as religious ties? Because you did speak about the fact that he was the People's Pope. He took on a lot of political issues as well. What's your take on this?
Well, I think you have said it correctly, walking a tightrope between the worldly and the spiritual. The Pope is a world leader, but he's not a political leader like any others. He's not democratically elected, but he is seen as representing the voice of over 1.4 billion believers. So he is listened to by world leaders, but of course would never be represented at the UN or the G7 or anything like that. So he has a bit of a different role, I believe. And in many cases, Pope Francis was more controversial than his predecessor, Benedict, who was more of the quietist position, which means don't get so involved in worldly affairs. Pope Benedict, of course, who died a few years ago, was very much a man of the Vatican who knew the hierarchy extremely well, and as the assistant to his predecessor, John Paul II. Now, John Paul II was another political pope. So he, in a sense, Francis has returned to that tradition, but from a bit of a different angle. I mean, Pope Francis was known for railing against the evils and the greeds of capitalism, which was initially very controversial when he came in, and a lot of believers, Catholic believers, who might be on the right wing of politics were quite alienated by this. I think in a sense it's been normalized, but the contrast is really there when you compare him to his predecessor 2 popes ago, John Paul II, who was himself born Karol Wojtyła from Poland. Now, Poland at that time was under communist rule as a satellite state of the Soviet Union, and they were oppressive towards the Catholic Church. And so what Pope John Paul II did was, when he visited places like Poland and the Eastern Bloc behind the Iron Curtain, he was seen as an oppositionary figure to communism. So that makes this contrast with Francis, who was not a communist in the sense of supporting the Soviet Union, but he was very much a critic of what he saw as the excesses of capitalism. So we've seen almost a left-wing pope and a right-wing pope and a more of a apolitical pope in the last 3. And I think a lot of people watching the conclave will be wondering what's in store for the next pope. So who is that going to be? This is a political arena, a deeply political arena, if not exactly a democratic one, because the papal conclave is selected or elected by cardinals who were then selected by the Pope. In this case, Francis, actually, as someone who took on the Vatican hierarchy, right, he actually appointed 80% of the people who will be selecting the next pope, which some people think means that they're going to choose a theological liberal, like Francis, who was also the first Jesuit pope, maybe the last Jesuit pope. It's seen as, it was very revolutionary that we had a Jesuit pope, and one who named himself Francis after St. Francis of Assisi, who was, of course, very close to the people, a healer, a preacher. And so will they be continuing his legacy, or are there different considerations for who's going to be the Bishop of Rome?
Absolutely. Now, just on the point that you were making, just to expand on that further, how does this papal funeral set the tone for perhaps the upcoming, as you mentioned, upcoming conclave? And how do you think Pope Francis's legacy could influence the direction that the Church takes next?
Well, I think your viewers may notice that they're driving outside of the St. Peter's Basilica. So this is the first time that there has been a coffin en route to the burial site since 1903. So this is a very historic funeral, because one of Francis's last wishes was to reform the ways in which the Pope is buried. So he will no longer be buried at St. Peter's, but St. Maria Maggiore. So this is something which represents that he wanted to get outside of the Vatican, outside of the power center of the Church and the spiritual home of the Church, to be among the people, still in Rome, of course. Again, this picks up where Francis wanted to be closer to the world, and not just to his fellow priests in the Vatican, to whom he was sometimes a bit controversial, perhaps even, you could even say, controversial, and had conflicts with certain members, particularly of the very much Roman hierarchy. How will this affect his successor? I think Pope Francis has been a trailblazer and a reformer, but I do think it's too early to say whether those reforms will stick, because often these things swing one way and then course corrects. So we might see someone who is a bit less radical than Pope Francis. So there is talk of a Filipino bishop being the favorite among the liberal Catholics, but it has to be pointed out that this Filipino archbishop is actually much closer to the Roman hierarchy than Francis was. He may be more liberal on some social aspects, but he was much more of a respecter of Vatican traditions. Now, Pope Francis was elected when the acceptability and popularity of the Catholic Church worldwide was at a historic low because of their failures to deal with child abuse scandals, really terrible scandals during Benedict and the reigns of previous popes. So they needed a reformer to get faith into so that people would have faith in the Catholic Church once again. I think in some senses, among the world and a global reputation, Francis has been very successful with that. But whether his legacy will be continued of being a pope in the world, of the world, will be continued, I think we're going to have to wait and see.
Right, absolutely. And just because you are a theologian as well, I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned how this funeral is different from the ones in the past. And we also know that Pope Francis did help reimagine a lot of the rites and rituals of the Vatican and further simplify them. That being said, I want to ask you, how do you see funerals have evolved over the centuries, and some symbolic rituals which were unique to papal funerals? How do you think those have evolved?
Well, as I said, this is the first time that the funeral procession is taking this route since 1903. This is known as the route of the Pope, because historically it was in fact the route which the Pope went down. But the destination is different. It's not going to the St. Peter's Basilica, where historically popes have been buried, but to a site alongside the river Tiber, which is considerably more modest. And so I wonder if this will stick, to be honest with you, or whether his successor will reform this and go back. Because as I mentioned before, not all of Pope Francis's wishes have been popular with the clergy, and it is also the Pope's job to represent the clergy. Pope Francis saw his priorities more as the believers, but we may see not a backlash, I think that would be too strong, but we may see a reaction against that with the next cardinals. So a number of rites and rituals have been simplified. He was a reforming pope, but very much in the tradition of the great reforms of the Second Vatican Council, which was in the 1960s. Whereas, you could see John Paul II as a counter-revolutionary against that. So there's always this cyclical swing in Vatican politics, in papal politics. So it's too hard to say. But of course, I do believe that the route of the Catholic Church is towards gradually more liberalism, but nowhere near as much as the liberal reformers in the church, many of whom are based in Germany. The German Catholic Church is known as the most liberal in terms of social questions such as female priests, gay priests, openly gay priests, we should say, because there are, of course, many, many gay priests who do keep their sexuality private. And Pope Francis actually made a number of quite controversial remarks a few years ago about, the air of, I'm not going to say the word, but homosexuality. He used something of an Italian slur. So I think these are the questions which will be approaching the Catholic Church and which they'll have to confront. I think Francis did a very good job of that tightrope, but he delayed some of the actually really crucial and controversial decisions, instead focusing on matters of ecclesiastical politics and ritual rather than these deep-seated controversial theological and social issues which the Church will have to face in this century.
All right. Well, Mr. James Jackson, thank you so much for joining us on WION A World as One. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your insights on this.
Thank you for having me.
For latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.